Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get any updates to our forecasts, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get any updates to the forecast for that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the radar outage that we have coming up on September 14th. This is going to last for 10 days till September 24th, and this is for the Fairbanks radar, or the Pedro Dome radar, that operates for the greater Fairbanks area. We do want to point out that during this outage, the standard level of hazardous weather forecasting will still continue out of the Fairbanks office. We just won't have the radar for some of the support for that. This is a scheduled planned maintenance. This will help extend the lifetime of the radar, but for that 10-day period, we don't expect to be receiving radar data from the site as it's being worked on to upgrade it for the future. Taking a look down in southeast Alaska, looking at some nice weather coming up through the remainder of the weekend into Monday. We're going to have some highs in the low to mid 60s. Lows are going to drop down in the 30s for northern locations, which will lead for the possibility of frost. And then we'll have some areas in the south that'll stay a little bit warmer into the lower 40s. Now with that potential for frost, we do have some frost advisories out for the area down in the Panhandle area, as far east as the Juneau area, and then up towards the Haines and Skagway area, and then out west by the Yakutat area. We do have several frost advisories out for all of those locations in the northern Panhandle. Those are going to be out from 2 a.m. on Sunday until 7 a.m. on Sunday. Up further to the north, we also have a frost advisory out for the Fairbanks area, and that one is going to be for the greater Fairbanks area Saturday night into Sunday morning. That will last until approximately noon on Sunday. And temperatures are going to be right around freezing, resulting in the frost formation. So we are looking at that in the Fairbanks area as well, and some areas of fog around much of the interior as well. As you look out at our satellite imagery, we can start with our low pressure system out to the west by the western Aleutian Islands, pushing its frontal system all the way around into the central portions of the Bering Sea, down by the central Aleutian Islands as well, bringing cloud cover to all of these areas. If you notice as we watch this loop again, the low itself is not moving all that much. That's because it's starting to occlude, so we don't expect that system the low center of that system to move very much as that system does occlude. Out over mainland Alaska, with the high pressure dominating the area, we're not seeing a lot of high level clouds over the mainland. And then down by the Panhandle area, we have another weaker wave moving into the eastern portions of the Gulf, bringing some cloud cover towards the Panhandle area. As we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we'll start with our system out west that's bringing rain to the western and central Aleutian Islands, as well as some rain out ahead of the front, pushing into the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island area. But high pressure is dominating mainland Alaska, all the way down from the Alaska Peninsula area, up through the northwestern portions of the state, and then out to the east. This is resulting in some fog around the Kotzebue Sound area and up north along the coastline and much of the Arctic coast as well. Some isolated areas of rain showers are going to be expected underneath that as well. As we look out over the eastern interior, another area of rain, but for south central Alaska and the Panhandle, not expecting any rain for the remainder of today. As you look into tonight, staying pretty dry for the Panhandle area, as well as much of mainland Alaska as our high pressure remains in place through tonight. That will allow for some fog to form throughout much of the interior, as well as along the Arctic coastline, with just some isolated rain and snow showers in the eastern portions of the Arctic coast. Our frontal system is being largely held up by this high pressure out over the state, but still pushing precip ever so slightly further to the east. And that's going to bring some rain to the coastline of the YK Delta, as well as out to the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. And we're going to see continued rain for the Pribilof Islands and central and western Aleutians. As we move into Sunday, this system is still slowly pushing to the east, still bringing rain throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians, but starting to push a little bit further into the west coast and up a little bit further to the north to the Seward Peninsula on Sunday, as well as bringing rain to the Alaska Peninsula. High pressure still dominating mainland Alaska, however, keeping the majority of the mainland dry, as well as the Panhandle area. Up along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see some fog from the Point Hope area and through the Arctic coast, and a mixture of rain along much of the coastline as well. Then as we move into Monday, our high pressure is starting to break down a little bit and push off a little bit further to the east. This is allowing for a triple point low to form off of our old boundary, bringing up another push of rain into western Alaska. This time it'll push in a little bit further into the Galena area and down south through the Bristol Bay area, as well as bringing rain throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. As we look up along the Arctic coast, expecting more fog to be up there, with a mixture of rain and snow mixing with the fog as we look further off to the east. However, with that high pressure moving even more in over the Panhandle area, not expecting any new precipitation for the Panhandle on Monday. So look at our low temperatures starting Sunday morning, staying down in the Panhandle area. Temperatures dropping into the 40s in the southern locations, but down into those 30s as we move up to the northern locations of the Panhandle. As we look out over south central Alaska, most locations near the water dropping down into the 40s, getting colder as we get to the more interior locations, coldest in the area's Copper River Basin, getting down to 27 degrees at Glen Allen. Up in the interior, temperatures dropping down to below freezing for the central and eastern locations, but staying in the 30s to near 40 for western locations. Down in the 40s through much of southwestern portion of the state, as well as the Seward Peninsula and for St. Lawrence Island. And then down into the mid-30s for western places along the Arctic coastline, and down around freezing for eastern locations, with Arctic Village being the coldest in the state at 24 degrees. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down to near 50, and in the mid-40s for the Aleutians, and 48 for St. Paul. Afternoon highs for Sunday, getting up into the 50s for the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilof Islands, getting to near 60 for the Bristol Bay area and Alaska Peninsula, mid-50s for the YK Delta area, as well as much of the interior portions of the state, and then right around 50 degrees for the Seward Peninsula. Up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures are going to be in the lower 40s, and then 38 through the pass. Down in south central Alaska, temperatures getting up into the upper 50s to right around 60 degrees, and then in the Panhandle area in the mid 60s, with Yakutat being a little bit colder, 61 degrees for that expected high on Sunday. Low temperatures for Monday morning, dropping back down into the 40s for southern locations of the Panhandle, but into the 30s for those northern locations. As we look over south central Alaska, again warmer by the water, we're going to see temperatures down in the lower 40s into the 30s for many of the locations a little bit more removed from the water, with 28 for Galena. Mid-30s for the central and eastern portions of the interior, and 40s throughout much of the western interior as well as the Seward Peninsula down through southwest Alaska. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s, and then all the way down in the Alaska Peninsula, we're going to see temperatures in the lower 50s, and then mid-40s for the Aleutian Islands and Pribilof Islands. Taking a look at our afternoon highs for Monday, getting up into the 50s for the Pribilofs and for the Aleutians, mid-50s for the Alaska Peninsula, and right around 60 degrees for the Bristol Bay area. Mid-50s for the rest of southwest Alaska, and then pushing those mid-50s into the western interior, getting up into the upper 50s for the remainder of the interior, and right around 50 degrees for the Seward Peninsula. Up along the Arctic coastline, getting up to the 40s. For the most part, Kaktovik staying a little bit cooler there, only getting up to 39 degrees. For south central Alaska, seeing temperatures in the upper 50s, with more southern locations getting up to around 60 degrees. Then in the Panhandle, temperatures getting up to right around 60, a little bit warmer in the south, mid-60s there.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Sunday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have some MEFR and IFR conditions. Especially where our front is pushing through, we do have IFR conditions moving through the central, Bering Sea, and Aleutian Islands. Out over mainland Alaska, most areas will be VFR, however some spotty areas of MVFR in the interior. Then as we get up into the Brooks Range, we're going to see more MVFR all the way through the North Slope area. Down in the Panhandle, also expecting to see VFR conditions through Sunday morning. Looking into Sunday afternoon, continuing VFR conditions for the Panhandle and the majority of the southern mainland. As we move up to northern portions of the interior, starting to see some more MVFR and then MVFR up along the North Slope area. Some areas along the west coast going to see some marginal conditions as that front gets closer to the area and starting to see more rain and lower ceilings. And then we'll see some IFR conditions out over the central and eastern portions of the Bering Sea and Aleutians, with MVFR conditions further to the west. As we move into Monday morning, MVFR conditions continuing out over the western Bering and Aleutians, and seeing continued IFR conditions for the central and eastern locations of the Bering and Aleutians, and now moving into the Alaska Peninsula area. Still seeing some of those MVFR conditions also making it to the west coast of the state, but the majority of the central and southern portions of mainland Alaska are going to be VFR. However, in the Brooks Range, we are going to see some IFR conditions and then MVFR conditions all for the North Slope. Down in the Panhandle, continued VFR conditions are expected. Monday afternoon, still continuing to see VFR conditions for the Panhandle area and VFR conditions for much of mainland Alaska as well until we get along the west coast and areas up along the Arctic coastline northeastern portions of the Brooks Range. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, primarily MVFR conditions, but once again we'll see some IFR conditions out over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, down through the eastern Aleutians, and for the Alaska Peninsula. For our passes, starting up north in Anaktuvuk Pass, MVFR conditions improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan Pass will also start off marginal, improve to VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR throughout the day on Sunday, as well as at Rainy Pass. Windy Pass will also be VFR all day Sunday. Isabel Pass will start off marginal, and then in late morning turn over to VFR conditions. Mentasta Pass also expected to be VFR throughout the day. Tenedo Pass VFR expected all day Sunday, as well as at Portage, and Chilkoot and White both expected to be VFR throughout the day Sunday. Looking at our freezing levels, we still have some of the colder air pushing down into southeastern portions of mainland Alaska from the north, with some freezing levels down to 2,000 feet over some of those areas. We have some of our warmer air coming up from the southerly push out by the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, getting freezing levels up to as high as 12,000 feet in those locations. Colder out to the west, where we have some of the cold air wrapping on the backside of our low, getting pulled down from the north, down around 4,000 feet for those freezing levels by the western Aleutians. Taking a look at our icing and some of that colder air on the backside of the main low, we do have icing above 5,000 feet for the western Aleutians, and then an area between 2,000 and 5,000 feet in the northwestern portions of the state. For our jet stream, main branch of the jet moving through the central Bering Sea out of a southwesterly direction, 120 knots, curving over our ridging out over mainland Alaska out of a northerly direction, moving through south central up to as high as 100 knots, and then coming back in over the southern portions of the Panhandle out of a southwesterly direction, around 90 knots there. As we look down to 9,000 feet, flow over much of mainland Alaska is pretty light. A little bit stronger winds moving into the North Gulf, as we have northerly winds around 25 knots there. And just off to the east of the Panhandle area, we have southwesterly winds 20 knots. But our strongest winds are going to be circulating around our low pressure system in front, pushing through the Bering Sea, where we have westerly winds 45 knots over the western Aleutians, southwest winds 45 knots out over the central Aleutians, pretty similar out over the Pribilof Islands, and moving in over southwest Alaska at around 35 knots out of that westerly direction, and then southerly winds 30 knots up by the Seward Peninsula. Down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow to 9,000 feet. Strongest winds are around our low, around 50 knots, westerly by the western Aleutians, southwesterly 35 by the central and eastern Aleutians, 45 knots out of a southerly direction moving up towards St. Lawrence Island, starting to bring in some of those stronger winds to southwest Alaska. And then some westerly winds around 40 knots up along the Arctic coastline, and 40 knots coming out of a northeasterly direction by the northern part of the Panhandle. Turbulence is circulating around our low for the Aleutian Islands below 3,000 and 4,000 feet, and then along the southwest coast below 4,000 feet is expected.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining me once again is Eric Stevens from the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, or GINA, based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Well, Dave, it's great to be back. Thanks for inviting us again.
Sure thing. And today we want to talk about identifying burn scars. That would be the burned up area after a wildfire when the flames and the smoke are gone. We can see it if you drive by it on the roadway, of course, but from satellite we can also identify those places on the land, right?
You know it. You know that expression, ouch, that's going to leave a mark?
Yeah.
After you bang your knee getting out of the car.
Oh yeah.
Well, the ouch, it's going to leave a mark, that also applies to the landscape. Whenever a wildfire ravages through, it's going to leave a mark on the landscape. after a wildfire burns out, this is called a burn scar.
Okay.
And you can ask yourself, well, that's interesting. We can see a burn scar from space. Then the question is, well, why does that matter?
Okay.
Who cares?
Yeah, fire's over.
Right, the fire is over. We don't need to worry about this anymore. It turns out you kind of do, because burn scars are important. There's this old rule of thumb in the weather business that flood follows fire. The action of the fire in killing off the vegetation, in baking, kiln drying the landscape a little bit, can hinder the land's ability to absorb rainfall. So if you have a fire, especially if it's in complex mountainous terrain. This is classic in California. It can happen somewhat in Alaska too. You get a wildfire in steep, hilly, or mountainous terrain, rips off all the vegetation off the landscape. Then 6 months later, there's a big rainstorm, and you get a flash flood in that area. So flood can follow fire. That's why you got to know where the burn scars are. Secondly, a fire needs fuel to maintain itself. So if there's an old burn scar left over from a year or two ago, and then another summer later here in Alaska in the interior, it's a big wildfire season. If there's a fire advancing toward an old burn scar, well, guess what? That old burn scar can be tougher terrain for that new fire to get through because there's not as much fuel in that burn scar. So they almost act like a natural fire break. These are a couple of reasons why you need to know where those burn scars are. Alaska Fire Service has limited resources. They want to put their people and their equipment where it does the most good. They need to know, well, this is an area where there's no burn scar. We better put people here because that fire could really run.
So really important for weather forecasters and fire weather forecasters for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But then how do weather satellites actually detect those burn scars?
Good question.
Thanks.
Well, let's turn the Wayback Machine to the summer of 2015. That was a very active year. We've got a picture here taken up in the White Mountains. This is one of the fires in progress that summer, and if you look real close, you can almost see Frodo throwing the ring into the volcano there. So that's quite the vision. Well, let's look at a visible image. Here we are in Alaska's interior. This is before the fires got out of the cage in early summer of 2015. Let's zoom into the western interior here. Again, this is a weather satellite image of visible light, what the human eye can see. We're into the middle reach of the Yukon Valley there in the western interior, Galena area. And this is just a beautiful visible day. Nothing much going on. It's in early June before the fires really got active. But then in 2015, the fires got loose, especially in that western interior. Here's another image. The same satellite pass as that visible image, but now we're not quite looking at visible light.
Very different.
There's a slight change here. This image incorporates something called the veggie band. 0.86 micron wavelength. The micron's very tiny, but that wavelength responds to vegetation, the chlorophyll. So trees and grasses reflect that part of the electromagnetic spectrum back to the satellite. And so the satellite sees that. When signal comes at that wavelength to the satellite, we know, there's some vegetation growing there. This is great. You can identify coastlines so easily because you go from vegetation to water. Turns out if you have a burn scar, guess what? You burned away the vegetation, so that's going to show up. We're going to do a before, during, and after kind of look here. And so we're looking at before. So in this image, we got a lot of green out there. That's wonderful. Another fun thing about this kind of imagery is you can see down in the Alaska Range in the southeast corner of the image, it's blue. That's glaciers and snow in the mountains. So this is not really what the human eye can see. This is these wavelengths are beyond human vision, but we've made them look certain colors. So the vegetation looks green. Now let's look at that same kind of satellite recipe, but during the fires. This is in July. The fires are loose. You can see the smoke in the middle of the image, the smearing look of the smoke, and then we can see some clouds that are white, icy clouds are blue. So this is in July of 2015. The fires are doing their thing. We're burning up millions of acres. Now let's go to September. The fires are out. The audience has left the theater. You know, the event's over, right? We're done. But guess what? Now look at those brown patches.
Look at that.
All of those places are where the fire has burned away the vegetation. So you can see where the fires were. You can add up these perimeters, get acreage burned and such. And so that's good to know. Now remember, flood follows fire, and these are also natural fire breaks. So you need to know where these guys are. In the course of the 2015 summer season, we went from before with not much burn scar in this area to just a couple months later, we can see so much burn scarring on the landscape. What's interesting too about the satellite and looking at burn scars is you realize that burn scars are the gift that keeps on giving. You can forget that a couple of years ago, maybe there was a fire in a certain area, but the satellite won't forget. So in the summertime, we get wildfires in Alaska, but guess what? In the visible imagery here, we can see the burn scars just a little bit, but they're not as prominent as in that veggie band. But then you can't see them at all if you cover them up with snow, right?
Exactly.
So here's an image from the middle of the winter time, and snow on the ground by this recipe looks blue. Again, these are wavelengths of light that the human eye can't really see. We're getting up into the infrared, near infrared, and the way we've assigned colors is if there's snow on the ground or there's a glacier, it looks blue, kind of intuitive. So this is early April of the following year, 2016. Okay. We're just about to get into breakup. We got a lot of snow on the ground, and now it's all going to melt. And as the snow melts, then you get our final image here. Doesn't this look familiar? This looks like a lot of what we saw in September of the previous summer. So this is the spring of the next year. The fires themselves might not have overwintered, they're gone, but the fire scar does. And as the snow melts away, and then you have breakup, and then you have green up, whenever the leaves come out, the grass comes back, except in the burned areas, they're having a tough time because everything got burned off the previous year. So you can see these scars even the next summer, multiple years. It depends on what kind of vegetation there is. You know, some of the tussocky tundra grasses, they'll grow back really quick, but to get a forest to come back, that'll take much longer. So these burn scars, eventually the landscape will fill in the burn scar. It will heal itself, if you want to use that metaphor. But for the next few years, you can still keep track of these on satellite. And again, the reason we want to do that is that the burn scar can facilitate a flood, and it can act like a fire break. So there you are, the
fascinating tools. So if you're a weather satellite and you're looking at my bowl of vegetables here, you might be able to pick out which one's the pea, which one's the tomato, and which one's the carrot, and apply that information precisely to whatever it is you're working on there. That is really fascinating stuff, that we have that capability from so high above the planet Earth, and Alaska for that matter.
Yep, eat your veggies.
Yes, definitely. I think I will. I'm hungry. Thanks so much for joining us again, Eric, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We'll see you right here next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for a look at the marine forecast. We'll start off with the ice edge. The main thing to note is that we have seen some new ice formation around 80 north in the Beaufort Sea, but as far as the navigational waters, no ice in effect, and overall we're still on the melting trend. We expect those sea ice minimums to still happen in about 3 to 4 weeks. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska for Sunday's marine forecast, northerly winds for all locations in the inside waters from 10 to 25 knots, weakest to the south, highest as we get into the Lynn Canal area. Out over the Gulf, 15 to 20 knots for the most part, up in the very northern locations, around 10 knots there. On Monday, still northerly winds in the inside waters, a little bit weaker for the Lynn Canal area, 15 knots on Monday, and then 10 knots for the remainder of the inside waters. Out over the Gulf, westerly winds 10 knots in northern locations, and then becoming northerly in eastern locations at around 15 knots. On Sunday for south central Alaska, pretty weak winds for the most part and a relatively northerly direction. Some areas getting to around 15 knots, but most locations are going to be at 10. The areas of the stronger winds are going to be east of the Barren Islands and in the very northern portions of the Gulf. Then on Monday, the flow is going to change and become a lot more southerly. However, not a lot of increase in speeds. Most locations are going to be at 10 knots. The exception is going to be around the Barren Islands, where west of the Barrens are going to have southeast winds 15 knots with seas up to 4 feet. And then east of the Barren Islands, southwesterly winds 15 knots, seas around 3 feet. Out by the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, we're going to see all southeast winds. Weaker as we get further to the east around Kodiak Island, 10 knots there, and 10 knots through the Bristol Bay area. But as we get further out on the peninsula, we are going to see winds pick up to around 20 knots out of that southeasterly direction, with seas as high as 5 feet. Then on Monday, winds picking up a little bit, becoming southeasterly for much of the Bering side, 25 to 30 knots, and on the Pacific side, western locations, 25 knots, with seas up to as high as 10 feet, then becoming southwesterly as we approach Kodiak Island and dropping down to around 15 knots. On Sunday for the Aleutian Islands, south to southwest winds for the most part, 20 to 25 knots for central and eastern locations, and then 20 to 30 knots out west, with seas up to as high as 13 feet, highest for the western Aleutians. Then on Monday, staying out for the western Aleutians, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas up to as high as 10 feet, highest further out to the west. then becoming more easterly as we get to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. 15 to 20 knots for central locations, 25 to 30 knots by the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, we're going to see all southeast winds, 20 to 25 knots around the YK Delta area, 15 knots for Norton Sound area, southeast 25 for St. Matthew Island with seas up to as high as 13 feet, highest in the western locations, and then southerly winds 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. As we look into Monday, still southeast along the coastline, 30 knots south of Nunavik Island, dropping down as we get further to the north, 15 knots as we near St. Lawrence Island, and then 20 knots in the Norton Sound area. 15 knots out of the southeast for St. Matthew Island, and southwesterly winds 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, westerly winds are expected, 20 to 25 knots, dropping down to 15 knots as we get west of Wainwright, and then south to southeasterly winds as we drop further down the west coast, 10 to 15 knots north of the Bering Strait. South of the Bering Strait, southeasterly winds 25 knots with seas up to as high as 11 feet. On Monday along the coastline, east to southeast winds 15 knots are expected, and then up along the Arctic coast, westerly winds at 10 knots are expected with seas at 4 feet. Quick recap of our weather for tonight. We have a low pressure system out over the western portion of the Bering Sea, with its front slowly pushing to the east through the central Bering and central Aleutian Islands. This is going to bring rain throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians, as well as the Alaska Peninsula and the coastline of the YK Delta. High pressure is dominating mainland Alaska, extending down through the Kodiak Island area, which is going to allow for fog to develop overnight throughout the interior and then along the Arctic coastline as well, where we will still see a mixture of rain and snow showers in the very eastern portions of the Arctic. Then down by the Panhandle area, expecting to see dry conditions. As we move into Sunday, still going to be fairly dry for the Panhandle area, as well as much of mainland Alaska as high pressure continues to dominate. Some areas of fog expected along the Arctic coastline, mixing with rain in some of the areas as well. Our front, even though it's slow moving, is starting to bring rain to the west coast on Sunday, up as far north as the Seward Peninsula, down through the YK Delta coast and to the Alaska Peninsula. Also going to see rain throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Then on Monday, it's going to continue to see rain throughout the Bering and Aleutians, but our front will have now pushed into the western and mainland, bringing rain as far east as Galena and down through the Bristol Bay area. Some fog up along the Arctic coastline, but high pressure still keeping things fairly dry for eastern parts of mainland and down into the Panhandle. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.